I do not understand you. Have you ever thought about the things in life that are strange and weird and don't seem to make any sense? Have you thought about the questions that don't have a concrete answer? And if you did you ever feel this obligation to develop your own reason or explanation for those things? I know those are both some very deep questions to start a video off with, but if you answered yes to any of them, boy do I have the word for you. Interpretation. The Merriam-Webster dictionary describes interpretation as the act or result of explaining something. And at least from where I'm sitting, this seems to be something that we all do all the time. It plays a very big role in how we learn, how we socialize, and provides the lens in which we understand the world. So much about life and art and everything in between is left to our own interpretation. And I've come to realize the value and the true beauty of that fact. There are tons and tons of examples I could pull from to prove that. But there is one that I feel demonstrates the power and significance in finding your own meaning in a way that's unique, that's captivating, and, for lack of a better term, alien. Because, in my opinion, very few pieces of art manage to do it quite like Metroid II: The Return of Samus. Metroid II was a game that was made with a very distinct vision. It was a game that introduced us to SR388, and in doing that, pretty much acted as the origin story for the Metroids and how they got to be as life-threatening as they are. In the grand scheme of the series' continuity, this game is a very, very big deal and has ripple effects that can be felt in every other 2D Metroid afterwards. But the unfortunate truth is that despite how significant and important this game is to the series' continuity, it committed the heinous act of being a game on the Game Boy, a system that was incredibly limited both in terms of tech and input methods, and was only ever known for handling more basic and bite-sized experiences, given just how visually limited it was. Now, as a result of that, I feel like it was a bit of a necessity that the creators, and especially the fans, would have to do some interpreting in order to represent the events of Metroid 2 in a way that made sense to them. It's not like there's a mystery for what happened on SR388, but given how visually limited the Game Boy was, it simply couldn't represent those events or even the world that it was set in a very clear way. However, personally speaking, that's always been the kind of thing that has made analyzing art so much fun, and has actually made my experience with this game a lot more pleasant. Yeah, so just as a quick disclaimer, before making this video, I have never touched Metroid 2 that much at all. I played like the first couple minutes of it, but that was really only for the purpose of collecting stock footage. I never really made a thing to actually beat the game. However, things happen. Some very, very, very big things happen. And it's because of those things that has actually motivated me to go back and replay some of my favorite games in this series. But in the midst of those replays, I kept on thinking about the one game in the series that I kept ignoring. Every time I'd see a reference or acknowledgement to things that went down in that game, I felt a sense of guilt. I obviously know what that game meant to the series, and I have a gist of how those events relate to these games, but it just felt wrong to experience them without experiencing this one. So after a certain point, I stopped playing Metroid Dread. I booted up Game Boy NSO and actually sat down with Metroid 2. For real this time. However, I wanted to experience this game with the hope of getting one very specific thing out of it. Because of how important this game is to the franchise's lore, and because of how often the story has been retold, I want to see these impactful moments and events in their original state. I want to see how things were originally done and develop my own interpretation of these events. But regardless of if that even happens, I still want to go into this game with a positive mindset. I mean, this is the most important game in the series, and as such, I feel like I should delve into it with a baseline level of respect and curiosity. With all that being said, here goes nothing. As previously mentioned, this game has Samus running and gunning her way through the Metroid's homeworld. Metroid II is the 7th game in the overarching Metroid timeline, and in nearly every game leading up to it, the Metroids have proven time and time again to be the largest threats in the entire galaxy. The Federation obviously took note of this and sent out 2 squads of troops to the newly discovered planet. Their only mission? To wipe out the entire Metroid species all in one swift go. They didn't make it. Samus's only real objective here is to finish the job that those troops started. There are currently 39 remaining Metroids left on this planet, and it is your job to make sure that every single one of them is dead. It is a very basic mission in comparison to its contemporaries, but really, that's all Samus seems to be told when she arrives here, and that's all the information that you'll know when you start up the game for the first time, assuming that you read the manual. Now, I am not complaining about this fact, absolutely not. I'm notoriously bad with adventure games, so this is fantastic news to me. However, I can't help but share that same sense of weariness and mystery that I assume Samus must be feeling. But regardless of that fact, Samus herself is officially back in action. Now, her movement has been overhauled a lot since the last game. She finally learned how to shoot straight downwards and crouch, which are 2 monumental game changers. Attacking enemies is so much more comfortable now, and no longer have to break the pace of the game in order to do it. Not only that, but she actually did what good bounty hunters do, and kept the long beam and morph ball from the previous game. Well, what a concept! Right from the word go, Metroid II is making such a better first impression because Samus has the capabilities that the NES game could only dream of. But on that subject, it's worth noting that SR388 is nothing like Zebes. Even as early as in the first area, I was encountering some very strange things, and I'm not even just talking about the enemies. Areas that are covered in sand, vines that damage you upon contact, whatever these disappearing blocks even are. Like, I'm having a hard time putting my finger on what these things even are. I was left asking a lot of questions about this place and not receiving many straight answers. And I was more so loving just how mysterious and foreign the whole vibe of this planet was. It's just another thing about SR388 that makes it stand out from both past and future planets. But on that subject, I feel like we should probably introduce the map now, as in comparison to Planet Zebes, it is very obvious that SR388 is almost entirely vertical. It may not feel like it as you're playing, but SR388 is actually broken up into 10 areas. These areas are usually broken up by a pool of lava that can only be lowered by taking out a certain amount of Metroids. Basically, Metroid II's structure is a trek down into the heart of the planet, which is really good news to me because that means that this is one of the more linear games in the series. Okay, well, maybe linear isn't entirely the right word. It literally has 10 completely unique areas that are all pretty big in terms of size, and unlike a game like Metroid Fusion, it doesn't map out specifically where you should be going. However, as someone who never really grew up playing action-adventure games like Metroid, I've come to understand that getting lost and being confused as to where you should be going is part of the challenge in many of these games. I'm someone who was and still is pretty bad at noticing things, especially in a 3D environment, but even someone like me can feel like something's a bit off when a game just shows me an arrow that explicitly tells me where to go. I want the design of the game to push me in a certain direction without outright telling me where to go, and that is exactly what Metroid II is doing. Your sense of direction isn't always super clear, and you're still bound to get lost without proper directions. But in the back of your mind, you always know that the direction that you should be heading in is down. And that, on top of how straightforward and simple your objective is, makes Metroid II one of the most pick up and play friendly games in this series. It simplifies the formula just enough without completely taking away from what makes it so unique. And that is, again, just another thing that makes this game distinct. But I would argue that the most distinct thing about this game is the primary objective of fighting off the Metroids, each of which come in 4 unique types. The Alphas and the Omegas are the ones that will come across first, both of which will make a straight beeline for you and can be damaged at any angle. Now, I've never come up with any kind of strategy aside from spamming missiles and hoping for the best. I will say that anytime I defeat these guys without taking any damage, that gave me more euphoria than I think is normal. I'm such a loser. Now, as the game goes on, you'll then start encountering the Zetas and the Omegas, and in my opinion, these fights are a lot better. On top of having a lot more health, these guys can only be hit from either up front or behind, which means that the fights now require you to develop a strategy and aim for a specific weak point. Suffice to say, I had a lot more fun fighting these guys. However, something that all 4 of the bosses share is how the environments around them actually plays into the battles. The areas that you fight the Metroids in tend to have a lot of variation. Sometimes you have to shoot down matter that's in the way of fire, sometimes you have to fight them in this vertical shaft. Like, the environments that you fight them in prove to be every bit as important as the design of the fights themselves. Admittedly, this doesn't really do much to undermine the fact that the earlier Metroid fights are still kind of a crapshoot. But I want to still acknowledge just how much attention was given to something as minuscule as the arena that you're fighting on. And on that subject, I also took note of just how beautifully the Metroids were integrated into this world. Whenever you are about to encounter one, you'll see a broken shell of a hatched Metroid, letting you know that's somewhere nearby. And when you do encounter it, sometimes you'll see them hatch out of a shell, or even morph into an entirely different type of Metroid. And I was just in awe that the Game Boy could even pull off an effect like this. But again, this is just another thing that makes these encounters so exciting. Finding these Metroids is something that I will never get tired of. It'll never stop being fun to me. And it's solely because of just how well the concept was executed. Now, during my first playthrough of this game, I found myself having quite a bit to say about the upgrades, which makes sense given just how much more of them there are. Returning upgrades like the Ice Beam, Wave Beam, and Screw Attack function the exact same way as they did in Game 1. Although, I was deeply shocked at just how early you get them. By the end of the 3rd area, I'd already obtained like 7 upgrades, one of which being the space jump, which really surprised me. Definitely felt like I was getting away with something for having an endgame item show up this early. But speaking of the space jump, this is actually one of quite a few new upgrades that this game has on standby. And altogether, they're kind of a mixed bag. Starting with the good stuff, one of the most crucial upgrades you will get in this game is the Spire Ball. Being able to roll up walls and on the ceiling is not only an ingenious concept, but it completely changes how you go about exploration. All of a sudden, the walls can have that same amount of significance as the floor does, and it simply leads to so many more opportunities for traversal and item collection. The one unfortunate drawback, however, is that it is pretty finicky to use. Sometimes it freezes up on you when you change direction, so you have to tap a different direction on the D-pad in order to make it go, and even then, it probably won't even go in the direction that you want. I, for one, don't really mind dealing with this because of just how much fun I had using it, but this is still a very big flaw, and I can understand if this ruins the upgrade for some people. Another upgrade that I really like is the Spring Ball. Admittedly, it's not that deep of an upgrade, It just allows you to jump while in morph ball form, but I use the morph ball a lot more because of that. And also, it makes scaling up walls with the spiral ball incredibly snappy. I already mentioned the space jump, and it's actually a very useful upgrade in this game. Metroid 2's map is very vertical, so having something that basically allows you to fly is a very necessary addition, especially in places like Area 6, where it's almost nothing but a vertical shaft. And lastly, I know this really isn't an upgrade, but I could not express how happy I was when I discovered the recharge stations. Like, I honestly wasn't sure if they were even going to be here given just how primitive this game looked, but I am nonetheless thankful. Now let's talk about the bad ones. The Spazer and the Plasma Beam are the only two new beam types introduced in this game, and I don't really like either one of them. The Spazer is pretty much just a worse version of the Wave Beam. Like, I appreciate the wider range of coverage, but I more so find it incredibly superfluous when the Wave Beam has that same amount of coverage, but can also go through walls. And then the Plasma Beam just sucks. It still has the highest damage output in the game, but it doesn't really matter that much if you can barely hit anything. The beam moves in a perfectly straight line and moves incredibly quickly, both of which makes the act of hitting enemies a luck-based endeavor sometimes. Simply put, I just don't really bother with these beam upgrades. And when I discovered the room in Area 6 that has the other beam types you can swap to, I was very relieved. It's weird that this game doesn't have a Mega Man styled weapon screen for this kind of stuff, but I think that's a very smart idea to give the player this kind of opportunity. And it's oddly fitting that the opportunity props up right at the halfway point of this game. By this point, I had about 7 Metroids left, and I was genuinely taken aback by just how much fun I was having. The actual gameplay loop of exploring this planet, of fighting off these Metroids, like, it was just so captivating and engaging to me. So much so that there are actually multiple points in the footage gathering process where I either played the game a lot longer than I expected, or was having a hard time putting it down. However, when thinking about why this happened, among other things, I think it has a lot to do with the way in which I'm experiencing this game. Big shocker, I'm playing this game via the NSO app, using the Falcon Zero map on my phone as a guide, and listening to the Geek Critique live streams in the background. Yes, that last part was important. Now, this very much could just be me, but I think that playing the game in this way was a big factor into why I was so engaged. There were multiple points in my footage that I had to stop and look at my phone in order to see which area that I'm in, or how many Metroids in that area were left, and while most people might see flipping and flopping between the two to be a hassle, it's something that I genuinely enjoy doing. Something about using an external source as your map just makes it feel like you're actually exploring an unknown area, and in all honesty, I don't know if I would have had as much fun with this game if I didn't play it like this. Since we're talking about the map so much, I feel like now is a good time to mention that when you play this game with a map in front of you, you start to notice some very strange pacing decisions that are very confusing, particularly in this section of the map that is, and I am not kidding when I say this, the worst part of this game. Cue the music. So the lava pit clears up in Area 3 after you kill the Metroids, so you go down to Area 4, which is entirely a linear path to a single Gamma Metroid. Then, when you go back, you'll notice that the lava blocking you from the next area didn't move, and you somehow have to figure out that this lava pit was lowered after you killed that singular Gamma Metroid. So, you have to backtrack all the way to Area 3 again, and end up in Area 5 where there's only 2 Metroids. After you kill them, great news! You get to backtrack all the way to Area 4 because the lava pit is now lowered and you can now continue on with your life. You know, perhaps I made a bigger deal out of this than I really should have. Thankfully, this map is great at showing you how many Metroids you need in order to progress. So, on my first playthrough, this wasn't really that big of an issue. But regardless, I still have no idea why they thought structuring Area 4 and 5 like this was a good idea. Valuable information that the player needs to know is not presented to them, and it has the potential to make them bumble around in circles figuring out what they're supposed to do, which could have very easily been me if I didn't have a map by my side. But luckily, no other part of the game is structured like this, and the adventure is fairly smooth sailing for the rest of its runtime. With that being said though, this map still has its share of surprises. Area 7 and 8 is actually a very memorable part of the game for me, where you see that there's only 2 Metroids in Area 8 with nothing in Area 7. So you take out the Alpha and make your way back down where you came, only to see that the lava is actually risen, trapping you in Area 8. And when you climb up the other side of the shaft, you'll find an Omega Metroid come out of nowhere. Like that. That is awesome. Cause the way it subverts your expectations while also pushing you in the direction that you need to go in demonstrates how a more loose structure could actually be used to create surprises that are actually fun. However, perhaps the biggest surprise of this entire game, in my opinion, appears in the final, penultimate area, Area 10. I collected all the upgrades that I needed. I'm currently sitting at 5 energy tanks, 108 missiles, and only 1 Metroid remaining. I make my way up to the area, making sure to refill all my health and weapon ammo. I managed to find the egg of the very last Metroid on this entire planet. And then something funny happened. Okay, was not expecting the game to just randomly up the counter for no reason, but there are now 9 more Metroids to hunt down. If I could be honest for a second, I think that was one of the best fakeouts in this entire game. And it also helps that these are regular Metroids that you end up taking down in the exact same way as all the other games, meaning that this whole section of the game doesn't go on for very long. But actually, the most standout thing that I'm noticing about Area 10 is just how creepy and dreary the music is. It's actually kinda funny. I've yet to say a single word about this game's soundtrack until now. And while that's mostly thanks to how bad my script writing still is, I can't help but feel like the overall quality of the soundtrack has played a role in why. I want to say roughly 90% of this entire soundtrack is chaotically inconsistent. You get tracks like the overworld theme, which is very triumphant and exciting, or tracks like the Metroid bells that emphasize the horror and tension upon encountering such a vile freak of nature. But the thing is, even if you aren't super crazy about the composition, I feel like everyone can agree that these 2 tracks are, at the bare minimum, good music. And then we have Area 3. Now, any sane person who listened to that would think that it sounds like nothing. Just a bunch of noise coming out of a computer that probably has some sort of virus. However, while I think that is a totally fair conclusion to draw from this track, I'd argue that in doing that, you are kinda missing the point. Now, I did mention this somewhere in the script before, hopefully, but Metroid II's sole claim to fame was giving the Metroid's homeworld a more creepy and alien-like atmosphere. This place was supposed to make you feel uneasy and creep you out, but part of achieving this is presenting you with things that don't really make any sense and are hard to really understand. And while listening to the music with this in mind, the random beeps and boops from Area 3's theme plays into the atmosphere of this game in a very beautiful way. Yes, the track still sounds like nothing, it has no substance on the surface. But on my first playthrough, it served as yet another thing about this game that I did not understand. I would be lying to you if I said that scared me, but it still did make me the slightest bit uneasy. But to segue back to Area 10, while the track is a lot more complete in terms of how it sounds, It's almost like the aura of the entire planet is using those same beeps and boops from Area 3 and arranging them in a melody that you can actually comprehend as music. That is how downright terrifying it sounds. The music and the atmosphere mesh together so beautifully, and if anything, this was the track that made me have a much larger appreciation for the music in general. So, after I'd taken down all the Metroids and did a bit of stumbling, I managed to find my way into the lair of the one and only Metroid Queen. Now, I know this isn't really saying much, even as someone who liked the other Metroid fights, but the Queen is probably the best boss in the entire game. It's nothing all too special in the grand scheme of things, but the fight itself is at the very least a memorable one. Any normal player might just spam missiles and tank hits like every other fight in the game, but if you're clever, or have watched enough Metroid II video essays, you can stun her with the missiles, morph ball into her mouth, and plant bombs in her stomach, taking her down a lot quicker. This method alone makes the fight stand out in my mind, mainly because that's gotta be the most painful way to go about killing something. But all she needs is just a few more bombs to the stomach, and silence. Samus's health regains, the Metroid counter turns to 0, but there's silence. Everything is quiet. And then the music kicks in. The tone starts to shift. The moment is almost here. Samus makes her way out of the lair when she runs into the same egg that I saw at the beginning of the area. It's just standing there, waiting for someone to tempt fate and see what's inside. And when she approaches close enough, it happened. I know the game doesn't really do this scene justice, but seeing this moment, a moment that I've only ever witnessed through some other game, a moment that single-handedly changed the trajectory of this entire franchise, seeing this moment in its raw, original, unpolished state was euphoric. Now, I know what system this game is on. I know I probably shouldn't be feeling this way about it given how it's presented, but as I was climbing towards the surface, I couldn't help but have some very mild goosebumps on the way. There's no escape sequence. There's no explosions or mass death happening around you. Everything is quiet. Everything is peaceful. And it's during times like these that give you the space to do some thinking. I'm sure Samus herself is thinking about a lot of things right now. I mean, this is the first Metroid that she's ever encountered that wasn't hostile, that wasn't like the other Metroids. Granted, it'd be weird if it was. I mean, it is just a baby after all. But seeing how it orbits around her and takes care of the debris that's blocking her path, it really makes you wonder if this whole mission to wipe out the Metroids was worth it. It makes you wonder if anyone or anything is truly born evil. Maybe these creatures are capable of feeling affection. Maybe all they need is the guidance, the care, and the discipline of someone who knows just how valuable life is. Maybe they never got that chance, and seeing how it's the last Metroid in the entire galaxy, maybe they never will. But regardless, Samus makes her way to her ship, with the baby Metroid still swirling around her. It doesn't seem like it's going to be going anywhere anytime soon, so with very little options left, Samus makes the decision to take the baby with her. Even if the Metroid's homeworld is as quiet and dead as an abandoned building, it doesn't really seem to matter to her, because the last Metroid is in captivity, and the galaxy is at peace. That, Nerds and Geeks, was my very first ever playthrough of Metroid II, and I am just speechless. I know this video has been very positive towards this game, some may say overly so, but I could not comprehend just how much fun I was having while playing through it. However, even if I do say that, when thinking about the reasons for why that is, I came to the conclusion that very little of those reasons were solely based on the gameplay. Like, I still strongly believe that Metroid 2 adds a lot of really cool and nifty additions that makes the experience so much more playable. However, when I actually sat down and thought about the moments that really got me excited and really made me feel the most joyful, it very much was the moments of encountering a freaky object, or encountering a weird creepy music track, or just running into something about SR388 that I did not understand. Because each of those moments played a crucial role in making me more immersed in this world. If anything, I'd argue that Metroid 2 was the first time this series has successfully managed to make its world the true main character of the game. The NES Metroid, for as iconic and as ahead of its time as it was, it never felt like Zebes was really doing much to make you feel that sense of loneliness. I mean, it was still there, but it just didn't have that same tone as the rest of the series. In that aspect, Metroid 2 is a sequel that is very similar to the sequels of its time. It is the moment where Metroid started to find its way and capture an incredibly special spark. It was the point where Metroid started to feel like Metroid. But there is one more reason for why my first playthrough was so special. All the way back in the intro, I said that I played this game while having one persistent thought in the back of my mind. I wanted to play through this game, I wanted to see all the big events and important moments and experience them in their original state. As it turns out, doing that not only turned out to be a lot of fun, but it very well opened up my perspective, not just on the impact that this game has had, but also how fun and meaningful it is to develop your own interpretation on art. There are so many things about this game that are so subtle, so out of the way, and yet putting the pieces together and trying to make sense of this weird and unexplained world, it was just so much fun. And, you know, if you are an avid Metroid lore master, you probably know that there are plenty of explanations for why SR388 looks the way it does, between the Chozo living there for a long time, between the Metroids evolving to become more dangerous, and various other things that someone more qualified about Metroid lore can talk to you about. However, even if all of that is great and good, I tended to find a lot more meaning in this world when I arrived at my own conclusions about this stuff. I've asked this game a lot of questions during my first playthrough, and even as I saw the credits for the first time, it really set in just how little of them received any kind of answer. Every explanation that I came up with could be objectively wrong or could completely fly in the face of the official lore of the series. But I can only bring myself to care so much. I know for a fact that these moments would not have the same impact nor be as memorable to me personally with that knowledge. And if anything, I feel like the Baby Metroid scene is symbolic of the power and beauty that interpreting art can have. On two separate occasions, two very talented teams of people had the opportunity to show the world their interpretation of not only this monumental event, but the events of this entire game. And the beautiful thing about that is that they're all going about telling this same story in an entirely different way, introducing new mechanics, new puzzles, new pieces of lore, new areas entirely. Even when you look at the box art of all three versions of this game, they're all portrayed and depicted in entirely different ways, while still having that same iconic pose of Samus remaining perfectly intact. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, is it? We all know that there are so many things that don't seem to have an answer. Even with how far science has evolved and how much advanced technology is getting, even they can't provide answers to everything. At its best, it's disheartening. At its worst, it's really scary. But with games like Metroid II, with other pieces of art that leave so much about this world and its characters to your interpretation, it shows us that lack of knowledge about the world doesn't have to be a negative thing. Maybe the answers that we come up with, the conclusions that we come to, is enough. Sometimes it's more comforting to accept that fact and understand that inner peace within ourselves is more valuable than any piece of knowledge can give us. I know it's very strange how I'm relating a 1991 Game Boy game to this abstract concept about life, but Metroid 2 is art, and art is life, and life is art.